Alrighty, so as I'm sure you were just notified on your screens, this webinar is being recorded. I will share a little bit more on that momentarily. But we are just after noon, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Let me throw up my slide deck. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for February's Your Hour with APA Virginia, sponsored by our friends over at the Berkeley Group. Thank you, Berkeley Group. I am really glad to introduce Jeffrey Levine, the president of the Northern England chapter, or excuse me, the Northern New England chapter of APA Virginia, also with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So Jeff had a piece in the planning magazine of APA National, Think Big, Plan Small, Lessons from Icelandic Cities for the US, and we thought that it would be a great presentation. And even with our turnout today, it's already proving to be the case. So this is our CM number. I will share that in the chat with the link to the actual CM information page. As it is certified for AICP credits. I will be sharing some more information regarding our chapter conference upcoming in July in Portsmouth in just a moment. But I just wanted to let you know that our chapter's website page is virginia.planning.org. We really do encourage questions throughout this webinar. Please submit your questions through the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box. That will just help us keep track of all inquiries. During the more formal, you can ask questions throughout the webinar in the Q&A box, but during the more formal Q&A portion at the end, once Jeff will have the chance to get to the questions, feel free to use your raise hand feature to request to be unmuted if you'd prefer to ask your question out loud. I am going to hand over sharing capabilities while I run through a couple of conference plugs and also some plugs for Jeff's book. Alrighty. So our conference is in Portsmouth in July, and our call for session proposals is closing this Friday, February 28th at noon. And along with that, the call for award submissions is also closing the 28th. I'm sorry, not at noon, at midnight on the 28th, this Friday. So I will share the links to those forms on in the chat box momentarily, but I just wanted to drop that information. This year's conference theme is revolutionary planning, navigating the evolving Virginia planning landscape. Alrighty, and just on another note, while I'm plugging in some things, Jeff's book on leadership planning is available, and he has a free chapter for your reading, which we will also link in the chat momentarily. And he has a course that is upcoming, which I'll let him speak a little bit more to in momentarily. But thank you everybody for joining. I think we have a great presentation ahead of us. And feel free to direct message me if you have any logistical questions in the chat box. But otherwise, again, please submit your questions through the Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much. So let me give a quick introduction, and then I'll start sharing my screen and go through the material. So I'm Jeff Levine. I am an associate professor of the practice at MIT's Urban Studies and Planning program, and I do consulting as well for a bunch of communities, mostly in New England, mostly cities and towns, and on city planning issues, a lot of housing, a lot of zoning, a lot of land use work, and then sort of trying to figure out how to thread that needle of doing a good job with planning areas, but also making sure that they're attractive to investment. So kind of what I do now. It's still, I guess it's been a little while now, but honestly, my most of my background is as a city planner. I was the planning director in Portland, Maine for 7 years. And before that, I was the planning director in Brookline, Massachusetts for about 8 years. So my background's really as a municipal planner. I kind of come at this academic sort of world really from the world of practice and trying to figure out how and why it's helpful. So that, that's what led me to write the book on leadership and planning. And as Jillian mentioned, there's through our MITx platform, which is part of edX, we have a free online course also starting in April on the same topic. So if you're interested, grab a copy of the book or sign up for the class and see what you can learn. So starting off, just, my background, this came up sort of naturally. This is actually Reykjavik City Hall, which is one of the cooler sort of brutalist type buildings I've been in. It's really kind of built over a pond, as you can see. Um, Not surprisingly, it has some issues with water infiltration, but it is a kind of an amazing space. And I think I really wanted to start with it because to me, it's representative of how the cities in Iceland think sort of dynamically and, really do interesting things and aren't, find a nice balance between history and moving forward. And they've got a lot of challenges of the country coming up, which you'll see in my presentation. And it's interesting to see, what they do to try to address those challenges. Logistically, how did I get to go to Iceland to study planning? Well, I got a grant from an organization called the Whiting Foundation that's based in New England, and it's a small travel grant for people who don't tend to have access to other resources for research and travel. And like I said, I'm not really an academic, so I don't have grant funding or things like that. So I applied for it. I had been to Iceland once before, right before COVID. I live up in Maine and pretty much I think there's a rule that everybody in Maine has to go to Iceland and vice versa at some point. There's some interesting synergy between the two. And a lot of that actually is because there's a lot of similarities between the two, and there's a lot of sort of trade going back and forth, particularly as northern Atlantic trade gets more and more common. So it was sort of a natural connection. Got the grant, went out there, and as opposed to the folks who are looking at waterfalls and going hiking, which I highly recommend if you have time, I spent my time meeting with planners in their cities and talking about urban planning, which was really fun for me. So with that, let me go ahead and start sharing my screen, and I'll talk through the 3 cities that I focused on while I was there. And, hopefully you'll learn something from it. So just starting off, this is a park in the northern um, Icelandic city of Akureyri. I figure it's hard not to show a lot of pictures when you're in a country like that. Beautiful public art in the middle of a park at 1 a.m. So, this is the land of twilight. And then this time of year, it's the time when days are very short. When I was there, the days are very long. So it's just kind of amazing to be there. And again, this is sort of part of the opportunity that the country's facing in terms of attracting tourism and investment, not just because it's beautiful, but actually because it also has incredible resources of basically free energy. And I'll try to touch on that a little bit if I have time as well. So it's not just tourism, tourists going to visit, but there's also some real assets the country has that it's trying to figure out how to take advantage of. So I really focused on small cities here and without dwelling on it, because this is really just a slide from a presentation I give on small cities generally. My focus is on cities of about between 25,000 and 150,000, tend to have a traditional core downtown, maybe a service center regionally or a former one, may have a strong sense of political independence. And sometimes, as growth has happened, they get subsumed by a large metropolitan region. Sometimes they're on the edge and sometimes they're standalone. And I use this slide because the 3 cities I visited one of them is the center city of a large metro. And by large in Icelandic sense, I mean 100,000. One is at the edge of that metro region and has about 25 or 30,000 people. And then one is a standalone small city in northern Iceland with about 20,000 people. And they're all facing interesting challenges, but they fit into a lot of these prototypes. In the US, you see a lot of growing with in-migration in some cities, and you see a lot that are shrinking from out-migration. And then some that are being absorbed into larger metropolises. You can see that map of Minneapolis on the lower right and how it was expanding. There's a lot to say about this issue, but But the fact is that most of the cities in Iceland are growing within migration and are tend to be keeping their autonomy. So they might fit into this first category. In a broader sense, why do we care? And I think we care as planners. I think we underestimate how important these smaller cities are to the US. And I think, many planners get it, particularly the ones that work in these cities, but not everyone does. So I pulled some numbers. This may be a couple of years old now, but if anything, it's the same pretty much. You have 10 incorporated areas under the census of over 1 million residents with 26 million people. There's 163 places that are, between 150 and 1 million people on that bigger side, but probably not a big city by US standards or huge city with 51 million people, and then just as many people in these smaller cities for another 50 million people. So a lot of people live in these smaller cities. And I think as planners, more importantly than that, they have the capacity to hold a lot more people. Not everyone's going to want to live in Washington or New York or Boston or San Francisco, and not everyone's going to want to live out in the exurbs or suburbs. Small cities have the ability to create a walkable, livable community at a scale that's really attractive to a lot of people, and in many cases at a more affordable price point. That's not as true in New England, where I live and work, but in a lot of parts of the country, you can get a house in a smaller city for a relatively decent price, and that's attractive as people try to get into the housing market. So, on to the main event. Why are we here for Iceland? Iceland is a nation of small cities. It's a very young country. And what I find interesting about it, as planners, we often look at Europe. We look at the examples in Europe and say these European cities are doing everything right. Why can't we be more like them? Iceland really has a lot more in common with the US in many ways than in Europe. It's a very young country, very auto-oriented. There's no fixed rail transit in the entire country. There was one rail line for a while once, but there really is no rail service anymore. Very post-World War II development patterns. The country wasn't independent until 1944. A lot of its growth happened after that. So it's sort of a nice, more accessible, place to look at. A little bit about the way we might look to Canada as well. So looking at what happens in Iceland is a little more helpful sometimes and a little more accessible than maybe looking at a city in Europe where you may just say we can't even get anywhere near that, where we can't even get people to sort of limit the amount of free parking downtown. The other thing that's interesting about Iceland is that they're thinking about climate change at a systematic level. So, obviously, the apocryphal story is that they named Greenland to attract people, and Iceland to try to keep people from coming. I think there's a lot more to that story than that. But the fact is, Iceland's a pretty cold country, but it's also definitely being impacted by climate change. A lot of these white areas, which are year-round glaciers, are shrinking. The country's becoming warmer in some ways, but interestingly, talking to climate scientists while I was there, people that had talked to climate scientists about this, one of the concerns is that because the Gulf Stream might change during climate change, Iceland might actually become colder. And that's not necessarily a great thing for the country, given that it's already pretty cold there. So these are the three cities I looked at on a map of the country. Reykjavik, which is sort of on the lower right. It's not the lowest star, but the one right above it. The national capital, commercial hub of the country, center of health and education industries. This is where people come when they first land. The airport's actually pretty far outside of Reykjavik, but most of the connections are in Reykjavik. The domestic airport, which has basically all the flights within the country, is pretty much right downtown. I walked to it when I was there, which is sort of an interesting experience. And also the big hospitals and universities are there. So that's the big cheese. That's sort of the national sort of center, not just for the government, but for everything else. Kópavogur is a suburb basically of Reykjavik. It's a very fast growing city. It has a lot of the edge city characteristics to it. There's a lot of auto-oriented development occurring inland. And then on the coast, there's their more traditional built pattern. And one of the things they're really struggling with is how do they encourage more sort of sustainable development? How do they encourage development that's more walkable, that takes advantage of their natural assets, has better transit connections, and not more of the edge city sprawl, which I think they're not sort of adamantly opposed to, but they recognize it's not sustainable. And then up north, Akureyri, it's a freestanding city. It's really sort of the center of northern Iceland. It's the only city of any substantive size in the north. Um, and it's a major base for both economic activity and for tourism up north. So, again, it's sort of like one of those freestanding cities, amazingly beautiful. I'll show you some pictures, but also wrestling with a lot of planning issues that sound familiar. So these cities I mentioned are growing. Here's just some numbers from Statistics Iceland. And this is in the last 14 years. So keep that in mind when you look at these numbers. Pretty significant growth in all of these cities. Even Akureyri, which, in the US might be one of those shrinking cities, but definitely growing, maybe not quite as quickly as the ones near the national capital. But nonetheless, seeing a lot of growth. A lot of people are coming into Iceland. Iceland's part of the European Union's sort of migration agreement. It's not part of the European Union, but you are able to come into Iceland and work from any of the European Union countries. And there are certainly people that take advantage of that, in particular from Eastern Europe, it was pretty obvious when I was there seeing that. And by the way, this growth is actually happening in a lot of smaller cities in the US too. Between 2010 and 2024, these small cities I cited before grew 14%. And that's not insignificant. That's a sign that on the whole, these are places that are very attractive for people to live in. Obviously, there's shrinking cities and growing cities, but overall, that population growing from 78 million to almost 90 million is not insignificant. Okay, so let's look at each of these cities sort of in turn. So Reykjavik, the things that I found that were really interesting in Reykjavik, first off, again, they had a lot of the same challenges we have in the US. A lot of surface parking, a lot of roadways that were built out, designed for, limited access, sort of blown through neighborhoods, not entirely different from the way that we've done a lot of planning. This upper right picture is along their waterfront, an incredibly beautiful waterfront with a very high speed road. They do have trails on both sides, so they do have some advantages over a lot of American cities. And this isn't an elevated highway the way it might be in the US. But nonetheless, maybe not the most strategic thing to invest on your waterfront with. And this goes a long way along the waterfront in Reykjavik. I didn't even discover this waterfront until the second time I was there because it just, as beautiful as it was, it didn't seem to be a strong attraction. Some of the other things I saw that were interesting, they've really started to invest in sort of the texture and the scale of buildings. This is a fairly new development downtown in Reykjavik on the lower right, sorry, on the lower left. And you can see they built sort of a Hunarf. They've built a pedestrian scale street with some interesting pavings. The architectural quality is, it's one of the few places where I feel you see a lot of modern architecture that kind of hits it and hits a nice point. A lot of very attractive modern architecture that sort of rivals some of the traditional architecture. You also see, I'd mentioned City Hall before, and then finally up in the upper left, this was an interesting spot. This was in the middle of a city square, and this is a pickup and drop off spot for a community supportive agriculture. So for people who live in apartments, or other people who may have trouble getting fresh fruits and vegetables other than from the supermarket, this was a place where CSAs would drop off their deliveries. You'd have a code, and you could go in and pick up your package. And not only are you getting fresh fruits and vegetables, but you're getting to go into the square. You're contributing to sort of the social fabric of the community, and it's a nice looking building, honestly. Also, so they've invested in the details. So just a couple of those sort of little details that I think make a big difference when you're thinking about these downtowns. I then started looking at some of the redevelopment areas because to me, a lot of this was about how are you growing. It's great to see investment in current areas. So this neighborhood that's circled on this map is called Keldor. And this is an area that's currently mostly undeveloped and former farmland. There's a small sort of think tank that's located on there that's grant funded from one of the major foundations in the US. I forget if it's the Rockefeller Foundation, but definitely underutilized piece of land and owned by the state. Another thing I'd emphasize is they've looked at state-owned land and city-owned land to see how it could best be used. And they thought they would come up with a redevelopment plan for this area that made sense and helped grow the city in a way that didn't involve people living an hour outside of downtown. Before I leave this map, I just want to point out the downtown airport that you can see in the yellow closer to the center left. That is the major airport for the country domestically, and there's a huge discussion now about whether to relocate it outside of downtown. Um, Reykjavik wants to move it outside of downtown. There's a great opportunity to redevelop that land. You can just tell by looking at it that it's, an amazing piece of land for other uses. The tension is that the rest of the country is very dependent on it. If somebody gets hurt far out in eastern Iceland, they can fly to downtown Reykjavik and go to the hospital that's right next to this airport very easily. Um, so that tension of who are we serving? How can we balance uses that maybe aren't the most efficient or the most friendly, but serve a purpose with other goals? And if I was a betting person, I'd suspect that they're going to shrink that airport to one runway, not close it entirely, but who knows? So back to Keldor. Here's an image of it recently. I don't know. It seems very hazy, so I sort of thought it might be a painting, but I think it's actually an aerial photo. I think it's just a little hazy. And you can see a little development there is there. You're really not that far from downtown here. So, you have to think about the asset and what its best uses are. I asked them about urban agriculture or like the advantages of having farms near downtown. And they agreed that was an issue, but they also pointed out, I think somewhat rightfully, that there's a lot of farms in Iceland. Um, and a location like this that has real opportunities to connect to downtown, maybe you make the tough decision and think about using it as a place where people can live and live sustainably. And the idea of living sustainably, one of the keys to that was both a good plan and also good transit connections. So they had a competition, and they had lots of interest in this competition for how this site might get redeveloped. This is from the winning plan. And the basic idea was to build sub-neighborhoods, and each one of these, I think it's 7 sub-neighborhoods, would have a parking garage that would accommodate people's vehicles. Um, then once you were in the neighborhood, you generally wouldn't drive around. There would be, vehicle access if you needed to drop off a desk or something. You obviously can drive up to your front door, but the general daily activity would be to park in the garage of each of these 7 neighborhoods. These would be 4 to 5 story buildings, multifamily housing, which, this is one place where I think, maybe you do hit a little bit of a European sort of sense of like families do live in apartment buildings in Iceland. Not all of them. I saw a lot of single family, a lot of 2-family houses, but it's not as strange as it is in most of the US for a family to live in sort of a low rise apartment building, not necessarily a high rise. And this is sort of the key part that I'll circle back to a couple of times, you'll see the spine running through the planned neighborhoods. And that is a new bus rapid transit line that they are planning. I met with the folks from the planning for the capital, transport for the capital region that are planning these BRT lines. And this is going to be real BRT, for want of a better term. Its own right of way, limited stops, real-time bus information. This is their transit plan for the region, not just for Keldor, but you'll see for other parts as well. I also went to an existing neighborhood, relatively nearby, just to see what is the existing built form like. I took a bus out there, and the bus service there is pretty good. I wouldn't say it's amazing, but it was very solid, definitely better than you see in most places in the US. I was able to get a bus out there very quickly. They had shelters. They're not going to necessarily win any beauty contests, but they're kind of interesting and unique. And this area is very easy to get to and from downtown right now on existing buses, using, as I mentioned, these existing highways that they built after World War II, that at the very least have the ability to serve bus service in addition to vehicle service. So in Artun, I walked around a little bit, looked at the mixed form. This is a prototypical home in this neighborhood. I think this is a 2-family, might be a 3-family, but you can see how it's sort of not that different from American suburbs, other than that it's generally multifamily. A couple of other images, these are starting to get more into sort of flat style living, but again, not sort of what people get scared of when they think of multifamily, these huge high rises to the sky, sort of a gentle density with traditional materials that really fits in. And then one of the things that I thought was most amazing were these walkways. There was an entire pedestrian connection system within this neighborhood, in addition to the roadways, sometimes on the roads and sometimes crossing through to provide mid-block permeability. And this was the neighborhood school that I walked over to, and it was very easy to walk from any part of this neighborhood to the neighborhood school. And again, on these walkways that I think people felt pretty comfortable sending their kids on because you weren't even alongside a roadway, you were on your own dedicated walkway that led to the school. There's definitely some new development happening here on the other side of the major road. The neighborhood has a lot of old industrial land. They're starting to look at redeveloping a lot of that into housing. Again, a lot of it at a gentle scale. And then some fun sort of light industrial stuff mixed in that's still there. This is a pet store I went into that felt a lot like a Petco or a PetSmart or anything you might see in the US. I had to remind myself I had to get everything on my plane home, so I couldn't buy anything, but it felt very much like you might see in the US. So they're not looking to drive out these retail spaces, but sort of grow around them and grow the housing stock near downtown. I'll circle back to the BRT in a moment, but let's look at a couple of other places. This is an area called the Ocean Cluster District, or it's not its name, but the Ocean Cluster is located here. This is along the harbor, another sort of light industrial district. What was interesting about this area, first off, the mix of sort of day-to-day practical uses for average residents. There were a couple of supermarkets, there was a bookstore, mixed in with sort of light industrial, ocean-dependent uses, a food hall with local foods, and then the ocean cluster, which is an interesting model. This is a model that's starting to see some use in the US as well. There's an ocean cluster in Maine, and I believe there's several others in the country as well. And this is sort of a think tank that's looking at, basically what do we take out of the ocean and how can we use it more efficiently? So things like we get all these shells from crabs and we don't eat them. What can we do with them? And looking at developing things that can replace plastics, for example, that use these materials. Anything related to sort of ocean technology. And it takes up the upper story of this building. This is also where transport for the capital region is located. So, it's this interesting sort of space and think tank, really focused on the ocean, which is understandable. It's really hard to get away from the ocean in Iceland. Moving on to the second of these cities, Kópavogur. This is just south of Reykjavik. And this aerial shows you the more traditional, sort of older part of the city. My meeting with them in City Hall was right over the highway. You can see to the right side of that picture, they have a small cap over the highway where the City Hall is located. And then as you go east, from there, it gets very auto-oriented very quickly. Larger scale buildings. There is housing, but it's very much in high rises, shopping malls, all those things you see in the US as well. And then this was sort of the old traditional sort of town. A lot of singles and twos, some apartment buildings mixed in, and then around the outside, sort of these older redevelopment areas. So they really they've been focusing a lot of their planning on these areas that are circled here. And they also did a competition to develop a plan for this area. Part of what's driving it is that way out on the outer tip of one of these redevelopment areas is the Sky Lagoon, which is one of their relatively new sort of spas or springs. If you've ever gone to Iceland, they have these hot water pools, but they also have these hot water spas that some of them are natural lagoons that are naturally heated by geothermal. Some of them are artificial, which I think people don't really realize. This one's actually artificial. It does have an amazing view of the ocean, but it's starting to attract a lot of tourism. So I think the city really wanted to get ahead of that and say, what can we do with our redevelopment area other than just have Sky Lagoon there and have tourists bust in and out on their private buses and not really sort of visit Kópavogur at all. So I talked to them for a while, and then I went out and took a tour. You can see this is a waterfront path that goes around the outside that's been built. A lot of housing under construction. Again, this sort of gentle density, maybe getting a little bigger here, 3 to 4 stories. But at the same time, they do have a harbor over there called Karsnes, and this is their harbor. You can't see the on the round around behind these buildings, but there's sort of a boatyard, not huge again, but something that they feel very culturally attached to. So part of redeveloping this area really involved preserving that working waterfront. When I was in Portland, we spent a lot of time with the same issues. So trying to find that balance between new development and preserving the old. Just as an aside, one of the things I asked the planners in Kopelvogor, I said, so, in the US, when you try to redevelop like this, you get a lot of resistance from the neighborhood. How has this been received by the folks who are living sort of inside the middle of the peninsula? And they have the same issues we do. They've had a huge amount of opposition to redevelopment along the outside of the peninsula, concerns it's going to destroy quality of life, it's going to attract traffic, it's going to attract tourists. So finding that balance of making sure that people are heard, and that the key points they bring up are respected and addressed, but also realizing that you're going to grow and change somehow, so you can take control over it or you can let it control you. In this case, they're trying really hard in Carstens to sort of seize the day and say, we have this tourist attraction, we have this underdeveloped industrial land, let's try to do something good with it. So another key piece of that, I've circled back a couple of times to this transport for the capital region. This is a joint effort of the national government and 6 municipalities in the Reykjavik area. And they've signed a compact, which a transport treaty that basically says that we want to build a BRT network around our entire region. And we want to be able to get 2/3 of the population within a 5-minute walk of transit by 2040. So they have specific goals, they have a strong agreement. These 6 communities in the national government have this treaty. The first step is going to be what's called the city line. I won't try to pronounce it in Icelandic, but that's the first BRT line that's planned. And it's actually going into construction fairly soon, to the point where the folks at Transport for the Capital Region believe it's going to happen. You know how it is for a while. You say, is this really going to happen or not? But this line is actually going to connect Kopelvogor to the south to downtown Reykjavik over a new bridge. There will be a bus and bike bridge, bus, bike, and walking bridge only. That will cut a bunch of time off of getting to that part of Kopelvogor from downtown. It will then continue to the east to Keldor, which I showed you before. So there's a reason why I've shown you these places. They're all going to be connected, hopefully, by this BRT line. And you can see the master plan for the BRT lines here, all the red lines, all of which may or may not come to fruition. And you can see the first route, which is this dark red line that will go, through Kopelvogor, through downtown, and then out to Keldor, and have a great deal of a dedicated right of way. And then in other places, signal preemption, some of the other best practices for BRT. They say they looked at doing light rail. There was a lot of sort of emotional attachment to light rail. At the end of the day, they decided that a BRT line was going to be more effective, more cost effective, also just more able to get done more quickly. And in general, I mentioned they don't have any rail lines in the entire country. So setting up an infrastructure to maintain a light rail system was probably going to be more challenging than fixing buses, which they already know how to do. They already run an extensive transit system, both in Reykjavik and around the country. A couple images of the bridge. This image is a little fuzzy, my apologies, but you get the sense of, the the scale and what it's designed for, bike, ped, bus. And then here's a slightly broader image. Again, these red routes are bus routes only. There is a bridge for other people's vehicles. Further into the harbor, it's not quite as convenient to downtown. But I think this piece by itself is really going to help sort of this BRT line succeed, because it's going to save so much time. I took the bus to Kopelvogor from downtown, and it was a little bit of a haul. You kind of had to go out to the highway and then go south and then get off. This will just cut right over. And part of the idea is to bring people to the Sky Lagoon, perhaps without having to be these sort of private buses that go in, idle and wait the whole time, and then bring people back to their hotels, and help people sort of stay a little longer, interact with the community a little more, maybe check out the bike and walking paths. I walked around for a while. It was beautiful. I could have spent all day there, but I was actually there to talk to people, so I didn't. But really just an amazing location. And just some images of parts of Karsnäs that are built out now. So they're starting to build out. These are some of the buildings that are done, with a lot more underway, as you saw in the earlier picture. Okay, so moving on, I walked over to the city airport and I got on a plane, a propeller plane, which was something I hadn't been on in a while. Flew over the center of Iceland, so you can see a picture there of flying over the center of Iceland. It unfortunately was a little cloudy most of the time, but it cleared up as I got further north. So I got a couple of pictures. Um, and there's nothing in the middle of Iceland. So everything that happens in Iceland is within a short distance of the coast, and it's really pretty much a coastal community. It's just not hospitable inland. It's beautiful for tourists. I actually haven't been in there, um, but but pretty intimidating and not that safe if you don't know what you're doing. And I landed in the northern sort of capital, Akureyri of the country. This is their sort of theme is the heart. So you'll see their traffic lights have hearts. They have a lot of heart sort of material. They're also interesting. They're built on the side of a fjord, so it's very steep. Again, one of those questions about how can you build a walkable, bikeable community in a steep location, which many people have dealt with. This is their sort of cathedral. Reykjavik has a signature cathedral that's in sort of a modernist style. And this is Akureyri's sort of response, another sort of modernist cathedral that actually looks fairly different, but same basic idea. These are not old European cathedrals. These are 20th century buildings. Oops. So Akureyri, like I said, it's built on the side of a fjord. Their strategy for transit, given that it's not as much of a transit sort of population, not as used to transit, not as necessary because there's plenty of parking. They provide free bus service. They've made the decision that they're not going to charge for their transit service. They also have a number of other mobility services and an urban trail system that work really well together. They have scooter sharing, they have bike sharing. I saw a lot of e-bikes there. This is one of those places where I think sort of electrifying the bike and scooter fleet really helps because it makes it much more workable in a steep place like this. They also have a waterfront highway. I mentioned the waterfront highway in Reykjavik. These guys really have one that really cuts off a lot of downtown, and you can see it right along the coast there. Um, again, it's a little bit of a different scale. They spent a while talking about how their waterfront highway is really cutting off their downtown from their waterfront. And I finally had to sort of say, do you mean that sort of two-lane highway that you have you know, with sidewalks? And they said, yeah, it's terrible. And I said, oh, it gets a lot worse than that in the US. But I hear you, it is cutting off the waterfront from downtown. So that's one of those things that they're really working on is how do they reconnect across Route 1, as they call it. I'm working with the state. The state's obviously focused on getting people through the city safely and efficiently, usually in vehicles. The city's thinking much more about how do we get people across the highway. So trying to come up with those middle grounds and some of the things that they're going to be trying, I think will be interesting to try to reconnect while keeping the highway obviously operational. Just another image of there, you get a sense of the city and how quickly it becomes mountainous behind the city. This is that downtown church that I mentioned. So really a beautiful place with an amazing trail system. And they have an amazing northern botanical garden where they have a lot of Arctic plants, which I'll show you pictures of in a second. Just as sort of a gem of a city. Most people go there and stay overnight and then go hiking all the time and don't spend any time in the city. I got to spend 4 days there. And really in the city, I mostly was looking at the planning of Akureyri. So I walked around a lot and I got to see the urban trails and what there was to do. And not a bad little city for 20,000 people. And many more to come, it looks like. They've looked at what's happening with their housing stock. They had a huge crash in 2008, even worse than we did. So things really ground to a halt for a few years. But they picked back up again, maybe not quite as much as they did before. But they're seeing a lot of apartment building, and they're seeing it in a lot of different places around the city. So you can see here's just 3 areas they picked out for me as areas where they're seeing a lot of development. A lot of this is occurring on city-owned land. So the city has things like there's an old campground that's not being used anymore, and they're going to redevelop the campground into housing. Again, locally very unpopular with the people who live near the campground, But, as a planner, when you walk around this unused campground that's right near downtown, you say, yeah, this is a place that makes sense to have housing. Just make sure it fits in with the rest of the community. Took a lot of pictures. I only have a few here to show you, but just try to get some pictures of some of the new development there. Um, everyone's opinions will differ. I thought they did a really nice job balancing modern design with traditional design. They still have the gabled roofs, and they use a lot of the metal. That's just a very traditional material in Iceland. But they don't have the snout houses with the parking on the bottom. This is actually the back of this building. So you do see where the parking is. But in general, did a nice job making them feel like walkable parts of the community, not sort of standalone sort of hubs where you drive in, go upstairs, and you're done. They also have, this is just one of the paths I wanted to highlight. They have this path from their junior college up at the top of the hill down to where there used to be a theater and there used to be a bunch of bars. There still is some, not as much as there used to be. Um, and this path was interesting. On the way down, it's called the path to oblivion because students were going down to get blasted basically, or to sin. And then on the way up, it's called the path to learning because you're walking up to the junior college, you're going up to get educated. And then halfway down, they actually had this sort of museum, which you really can't drive to. There was a museum of the history of Akureyri, and it's the house of a famous writer from the city. But the planner's note, there's always a planner's note here. In one of the rooms is a bunch of material from when he visited the Chicago World's Fair. So I thought that was an interesting sort of piece of, tying it into a lot of the planning that we know about in the US. They also have a cultural center. Most of these cities have invested in a cultural center sort of place where there's a theater, where there's rooms for meetings, things like that. Again, one of those places where I think modern architecture really does a pretty good job. The scale feels nice. It uses a bunch of different materials. It feels nice inside. It seems to function pretty well. This is right on the other side of the highway from most of downtown. So I got to experience that sort of feeling of separation, but it sort of reminds me of a lot of these sort of downtown traditional auditoriums that sometimes city halls have in the US. Finally, a lot of third places. This is right in the middle of the botanical gardens I mentioned. This is a little restaurant they have that it's just a really great little coffee shop restaurant to sit down and hang out. I'm sure in the winter it's cold outside, but even then, you probably get some amazing views. Just a beautiful building on the outside and the inside. I mean, very popular. I got there at 10 o'clock once, right when they were opening, and there was a line to get in. And this was on a weekday. So it wasn't that it was just a weekend crowd. Um, Very popular place to meet. Big fan of third places. And they did that really well in Akureyri. So they really hit a lot of things out of the park in that city. Finally, the ultimate third place. These public pools are very popular in Iceland. They have natural geothermal energy that can heat them. So traditionally, the way that these will work is you'll have an area where you go in and change. They'll have a traditional pool that's heated by geothermal energy. In this case, it's a bigger one, so they actually have a couple. They have these sort of hot pots that are various temperatures. So you see them labeled 30, 40, 25, different temperatures in Celsius, depending on how hot you want to get. I saw one that was so small, it was really just for one person, and I think it was 45. It was not designed to be a place where you spend a lot of time. And then saunas, steam baths, and apparently these get used year round. They're warm enough that in the winter people will go. And what was fun was I saw kids after school walking from the school to go to the pool. And it really sort of felt good. They weren't on their phones. I mean, they had phones with them, but they were going to use the third place. And every city in Iceland pretty much has one of these. Finally, at the very end, I did a little bit of academic sort of visiting. I visited the University of Iceland in Reykjavik and talked to a couple of folks there. I met with a woman who'd been a practicing planner who had a sort of very similar position to the one I have now. And I talked to someone in the business school. And that's what I sort of wanted to close on, talking about sort of their sense of the future. Basically, all their energy is geothermal or hydro. It's very inexpensive. Um, they are looking at decarbonization, and obviously this gives them a huge benefit, but they're having a real challenge with the air and water transport sectors. It's very hard to reduce carbon on air traffic, and they're very dependent on air traffic, both domestically and internationally. And the water transport, they're very dependent on water transport, and it's very hard to decarbonize water transport. So that's an area they're working on. And then finally, as they realize they have more energy than they can ever possibly use, the advantage of being built on a continental fault or a place where continental plates come together, they basically have become a center for processing raw goods. So countries will send in materials that need to be processed that use energy. Iceland can do that very cheap because they have a surplus of energy, and then it gets exported as completed goods. So they found sort of an interesting sort of sector there. And it really is an example of playing to your strength, but also sort of playing into a sustainable model for reducing the impacts of climate change, because this is energy that's actually happening anyways. The geothermal energy, tapping into it doesn't really do much damage. And you can actually use energy that might otherwise be using coal or oil or natural gas. I mentioned earlier, most people might say, oh, climate change, Iceland could use a little more of that. But the concern really that it may actually cool the country is something they're really keeping a close eye on. They're not necessarily looking to warm, but they're definitely not look to getting colder. But they are so far north. I was at the 66, up at 66 degrees, which if you're in Canada is incredibly frigid. I wouldn't say it was warm, but on a May day, it was 75 degrees out. It wasn't cold. It definitely gets cold in the winter, but they're pretty dependent on the Gulf Stream, as is a lot of Europe, honestly. And the concern that everyone assumes we're going to get warmer, we're not necessarily going to get warmer. The uncertainty of climate change is something they're concerned about. So finally, and then I'll take questions. Some of the lessons to take away from these from Iceland for these small U.S. cities: plan boldly. I thought the consistency of their planning and their willingness to stick to it was really impressive. It wasn't without pushback. So the assumption that, oh, everyone just gets it in other countries, that's not true. They're just being consistent, representing a clear vision, using things like international competitions to build attention for their plans, using surplus land for transit and housing opportunities. The multi-municipal compacts, I think, are really compelling. If communities can get together and enter into some sort of agreement, this is what we want to do. And it doesn't have to be a formal thing that passes a law. It can just be something that the chief elected officials sign. I worked on one of these in the Boston area on what was called the Urban Ring Transit Project. We had the Urban Ring Compact of the inner core municipalities that had all signed to make this happen. Unfortunately, that project didn't go forward for other reasons, but it wasn't from a lack of will from the host communities. Again, leveraging any tourist interests you may have, using things like value capture to capture some of the revenue they might spin off, being cognizant of the fact that tourists may impact your housing stock through short-term rentals, things like that. I love the urban path systems they developed and the complete street grids they can build. And then just it gave me faith in bus rapid transit. It really seemed like they could make BRT work, given, again, this boldness and this willingness to actually let it do its thing, not just sort of make it cheaper and cheaper until it's basically just a bus. So with that, a couple of final images from one of the most northern parts of Iceland that I went to, way up on the northern tip near Akureyri. And thanks very much. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm sure we have a bunch of questions now.
We do. Thank you so much, Jeff. Alrighty, let's get right into it. So our first question came from Jason SB, former board member of APA Virginia. Jason asks, regarding the housing development master plan in Keldur, who is doing the developing? Private, public, both? What does the private-public landscape look like there?
Sure, that's a good question. A lot of the sites that I looked at, not all of them, but many of them were publicly owned, as I mentioned, either by the state or by municipalities. So Keldur is owned publicly by the state, I believe. However, in Kópavogur, a lot of that land is private. So I would say it's a mix of both. They certainly are tapping into public land and figuring out if they need to retain it for any particular purposes or if it could be repurposed into housing. The development would happen privately, though. It's a capitalist country without a strong sort of social housing sort of bent, the way maybe some European countries do. So they're not imagining developing this land publicly necessarily. I think, everyone's hearing about social housing in the US as a movement. I think this is a country where they're trying to make that idea of using public and private resources in coordination is, they're giving that a try. Um, in the case of Kopavogor, the developer is private on those lands by the water, by the Sky Lagoon. And there has been some tension between the city and the developer there. The developer wants broader entitlements than the city is willing to give them. So there's a little bit of tension back and forth there. But I would say it's a range. There is definitely a more proactive public role in this, and a lot of that's because they control the land. Having said that, in the cities I've worked in, we've done similar things. So looking at what land you have and what you can do with it is always a way to try to get more sort of skin in the game.
Thank you. Alrighty, next up, we have a question from Nick Rogers, our president-elect of the APA Virginia chapter. Jeff, you mentioned tourism, which I understand has been an incredible boon to the Icelandic economy, intentionally in Iceland's post-recession years. Did you hear of any concerns with tourism taking over, and quote unquote taking over and degrading local communities' quality of life? If so, what are planners and other decision makers doing about it? The example that he has in mind of this tourism overreach is New Orleans French Quarter and Bourbon Street.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. One of the main reasons I wanted to go there is that a lot of the reasons why Iceland and Maine have a lot in common is that same thing, which is a lot of tourists and beyond tourists. I think it's hard. We generalize as tourists versus year-rounder. We're starting to see a lot more of a blur there, at least in Maine. We see a lot of people who live here but work remotely. We see people who live here, buy a condo downtown and live here in the warm months, or maybe just sporadically. So it's a little more of a continuum than it used to be, but absolutely, concerns about short-term rentals and how strong the hotel market is have been real issues, and just how it's driving up the price of everything. So a few things they're starting to do about it. A lot of it really, in my impression, comes down to value capture. The idea that if tourists are going to spend a lot of money in Iceland, how much of it can we spin off for public purposes? And the most notable example I see is at all the tourist locations, they charge for parking. So, in the US, you go to see a tourism spot, and unless it's a national park where you paid an entrance fee, generally you expect to park for free. And you would be very grumpy if you had to pay. In Iceland, you're expected to pay for parking in all of those places. And I haven't done a deep dive into what that funding goes towards, but it's going to public purposes, whether it's to fund general operations or maintain that location. And it's just expected that you'll pay for parking. And by the way, and this is where maybe it differs a little bit from the US, they will ticket very aggressively, and they will not hesitate to report to your rental company if you have unpaid tickets. And that applies with speeding as well. If you do go to Iceland, do not speed. They have cameras and you will be fined, pretty much guaranteed. So that is just a little bit of a difference. But I think the short answer is yes, they're very aware of it, and their strategy right now seems to value capture as much as they can.
Thank you. Alrighty, next up we have a question from David Levy. BRT systems have variable success. Did you get a sense of how much ridership they expect? It's not a very big metro area. Is there a lot of traffic that people will want to avoid?
Sure. And I would say the traffic there is, you know, like many small cities in the US. There is a rush hour. Maybe, the term slow and go may apply more than stop and go. Um, However, the cost of auto ownership is expensive there. They're importing all the oil, obviously. They're making a big move towards electrification, which I think may change the formula a little bit. I would say they clearly are ahead of us on electrification on electric vehicles, but they're not all the way there yet. Um, I did have ridership numbers. I don't have them handy, but I think they're being realistic. But part of the way that they expect it to be successful is through dedicated right-of-ways as much as possible, and signal preemption, and limited sort of true rapid transit stops. So I've been on a fair amount of BRT systems in the US, and some I would consider more real than others. Um, they seem to be planning something that's more like the real thing. So we'll see what actually happens. They do feel pretty positive about ridership, and I guess we'll find out when it opens.
Thank you. Next up, we have a question from Tom Bartnick. In the city center newer development, it looks like there's a lot of hardscape and very little streetscape in landscaping, particularly the lack of street trees. Is this an intentional planning policy? If so, why? And or is it more the result of what can successfully grow in tree pits or landscape strips?
Yes, so there's very few trees in the entire country. Um, it's not a forested country. There are a couple of places where there are some forests. It's not quite like Greenland where there's like one place where there's a forest. Um, but there aren't a lot of trees generally. And that's something you sort of notice and you get used to. I mean, you can see some on my virtual background. It's not like it's devoid of trees. Um, but I just don't think trees are as much of it's not like here in Maine, the pine tree state, where there's lots of trees. So they just maybe it's just not as much a part of what they generally sort of have as their natural aesthetic. I do wonder about how they handle things like drainage. The pictures do show a lot of hardscape. I did see a fair amount of rain gardens when I was there. I did see a lot of planning for natural treatment of stormwater. I didn't see a ton of street trees. I just don't think that's part of what Iceland considers authentic.
Thank you. Next up, we have a question from Danielle Aragoni. Can you talk a little bit about how they design to, quote, live with water the way that they do in the Netherlands? I'm intrigued by the symbolic meaning of the Reykjavik City Hall being built over water.
Yeah, I am too. They don't necessarily have the Netherlands situation where they have a lot of land close to sea level in the same way. I mean, it's pretty hilly. Yeah, as you saw, especially up north. The land rises pretty quickly out of the water, so there will be some coastal issues. Um, but I wouldn't say that it's this at the same level as a lot of places even here in the U.S. Working in Portland, we did a lot of planning for resiliency for the king tides that were increasing while we were there. Climate change was impacting sea level. Um, Not as much there. I suspect that's in part because the seas are already pretty rough in Iceland. So yes, I guess they could get rougher. But as I mentioned, climate change people seem to think it's going to affect that country differently. I didn't see having to live with the water in the same way. And the city hall, by the way, that's on a pond. So that I'm not quite sure how far we should read into it. It's mostly just sort of a nice welcoming entrance. Um, but it's an ocean faring country. If you go to the National Museum, it's all about the ocean. It's all about, getting across the rough seas. So I'm sure they're thinking about it. I just don't have a huge, deep answer on that.
Thank you. And it looks like we're running up against 1 o'clock, but I think we have just enough time to answer the remaining questions. So
Sure.
Paul Patterson asks, with the cheap energy there, did you see a large amount of data center uses?
Great question. I didn't. I'd love to follow up on that. I didn't, and it didn't come up when I spoke with the business professor about that. So yeah, I would think that that would be a use as well, and maybe it's just a challenge of transmitting from a data center in the middle of the Atlantic.
From an anonymous attendee, the question is asked, do you have any examples of the international competitions they might or might not have used?
Yep. So one of them I can recall right away is it's called like the New Cities Initiative. It was out of a Scandinavian think tank. I can try to get Jillian the link to the competition. It's no longer active. The foundation's moved on to other sort of placemaking initiatives, but they had a competition for a few years, and this was one of the sites one of the years. Sort of like how the ULI does these housing competitions in the US, the Heinz competition.
Alrighty, last two questions. We have a question from Eric Wahlberg, which I think came in as you were talking a little bit about rapid transit. How is the network funded?
Sure. And there's a lot of information on the Transport for the Capital Region webpage, which does a good job translating into English, which is worth a lot for me. Um, it's a combination of state funds, which we would consider federal funds, and local funding. So they're sort of layering a bunch of different funding, but it's fair to say that the national government is putting a lot of resources into this. They recognize the success of Reykjavik's important. They deeply believe in growing sustainably, and maybe that is a place where Iceland's starting to diverge from the US, but and the national government's putting money into it. So if you go on their website, it will talk about the financing, but it's the type of layer cake that we see here.
Thank you, Jeff. And then a question from the chat. Amol Deshpande, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing any names, asks, well, states, I'm sure it snows a lot in this part of the world, so I'm surprised to see the finished floor elevations to be the same as the sidewalk and parking lot of some of the houses and buildings you showed. So not necessarily a question, but if you wanted to
Sure.
add any commentary to that.
Yeah. And actually, it doesn't snow as much as you might think on the coast. Inland, it's a lot of snow. What I will say is that they are very aggressive about snow clearing. In my understanding, it's not like in the US where the residents are supposed to shovel the sidewalk in front of their home. They take clearing the snow very seriously because they have a long winter. They want to keep it clear. Um, so yeah, I didn't see a huge amount of needing to accommodate snow piles. They seem to haul it away, and they seem to be pretty into keeping the snow clear in the city. But I haven't been there in the depths of winter, so I can't speak better than that. I just sort of, it's one of those places where they just decided it was important to clear the snow away, and that seems to be something that they view as a public function.
Sounds like you have to return in wintertime.
Maybe that was a recommendation someone made to me is go back in January now.
Alrighty, well, that actually wraps up all of our questions. So I'm glad that we were able to get to everyone's inquiries. And Jeff has offered to be a resource. So his email will be sent out in the follow-up correspondence with attendees. If attendees, you think of any questions that you weren't able to ask or think of afterwards. But thank you so much, Jeff, for being a part of our series. The recording of this webinar will also be sent out in that e-blast and will be shared to the APA Virginia's YouTube chapter YouTube, excuse me, in the days to come. Um, Quick note for next up in the Your Hour series. We actually have a unique situation next month in which we will have two webinars in the series. The first being AICP law preparation with some lawyers and with our professional development officer, Caitlin Aboot. So that will be useful if you are interested in how the recent Supreme Court cases are impacting planners. The the webinar, which will take place, and excuse me, that webinar will take place on March 3rd, and then the webinar that will take place in the usual slot on the fourth Monday will be with DHCD covering economic development. Um, so stay tuned for more information. And again, thank you, Jeff, so much for sharing your insights and your research and takeaways from your time in Iceland. And hopefully, our attendees can walk away with a new perspective on our cities here.
Great. Thanks so much. It was fun.
Bye, everyone.